This is the flooding panel of the NYSDEC 2022 Conference on the Environment, and I want to thank everyone for being with us today and being part of this interesting platform that we have, which is GatherTown, as it interfaces with Zoom. I'm happy to be offering as moderator today this flooding panel, and I have three fantastic guests with me, and we're going to jump right in. I'm going to start with Dr. Mike McCann. Dr. Mike McCann is a climate adaptation specialist at the Nature Conservancy, where he works with communities and governments to plan for and adapt to climate change. He is part of a statewide team that works across New York's diverse floodplains to help build healthy and resilient shoreline communities. Prior to this, Mike worked as an urban marine ecologist on the Nature Conservancy's Oyster Project in New York City Harbor. Mike has a BS in environmental science from the University of Notre Dame and a PhD in ecology and evolution from Stony Brook, and completed a postdoc at Rutgers University in which he analyzed the impacts of the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill on food webs and energy flow in Louisiana salt marshes. Dr. McCann, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Julie. It's great to be here. So I'm happy to kick off this panel. Really excited to also hear what Libby and Jim have to share with all of us. But yeah, I think I'm really pleased because of this audience. I really believe that, the local governments, whether it's your mayor, your town supervisor, your board, or the conservation commissions, which many of you serve on, environmental commissions, I think that's really where the rubber hits the road for how our society is going to adapt to climate change. You folks are doing the hard work, and you serve as this really important interface between one end of the spectrum, the state, the federal government creating the policies, the programs, the funding streams, and the other end of the spectrum, it's the community members, the residents, business owners, renters, homeowners, but that local government's that link between the two. So hats off to all of you and the work that you do, helping to adapt our communities. I believe that the Nature Conservancy and other groups like us, well-resourced nonprofits, we play this unique position where we can help support you. So my email address is there, and it's really because it's an invitation. I want to hear about what are the things that you in the local community are struggling with, what's not working, what's working well in terms of adapting to climate change, because we want to make sure that when the Nature Conservancy designs a new solution, a new program, a new tool, that it's really meeting real needs for real communities. So if you're not familiar with the Nature Conservancy, the real quick intro, somewhat humble origins here in New York State in the 1950s, but now we're a big global conservation organization working all across the US and over 70 countries. Our mission's about conserving lands and waters on which all life depends. And we say all life because we really want to recognize that both people and nature are inherently linked here, and the well-being of one depends on the well-being of other. And really, the well-being of people and nature and our ecosystems is going to be a lot more difficult as our climate changes. So in New York, we're going to have a much warmer and a much wetter environment. So there's going to be greater coastal storms, more frequent and stronger. Our precipitation is going to come down much more suddenly and more intensely. And our base sea levels, they're going to continue to rise. So this is the challenge we face in New York. That's the focus of this panel about flooding. And I just want to name, the Nature Conservancy and my colleagues do a lot of great work to tackle climate change on both the mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the adaptation side, getting ready and prepared and becoming more resilient. So we do things like helping communities figure out where to site their solar production so it doesn't impair ecologically sensitive environments. We do things like helping the offshore wind industry when it's going about producing clean energy, doing it in ways that doesn't impact the marine life, marine mammals and fisheries and other sensitive environments. In places like New York City, we really rally a lot of partners around trees, because trees are this amazing adaptation mitigation combo, right? They make our cities more livable, but they also sequester carbon. So I just wanted to name a lot of the different things that my colleagues are doing. I'm part of a team that addresses flooding, and we work statewide. So we work all the way from Lake Ontario, where we see flooding like we did a few summers ago, down to the tip of Long Island, down to Southampton. So flooding, it's a statewide problem. I think this statistic always kind of blows my mind, is that every single citizen lives in a county somewhere in New York that has had at least one weather-related disaster since 2010, so in the last decade or so. So, flooding's not just a Hurricane Sandy thing, it's really everywhere throughout New York State. So I think, when communities, when our society experiences these flood events, there's a real paradigm for how we typically think about how we should respond, right? And it usually is, we first think about, how do we defend what we have? It takes the form of seawalls, of levees, even our dune systems. Those are essentially defenses that are trying to keep water at bay, trying to keep our homes, our businesses safe and dry. Then, if those features, are not suitable, they don't work, we then think about, how can we accommodate water? The iconic example would be elevating a home. It can temporarily be inundated, but can withstand, some degree of flooding. And really, only as a last resort do we think about saying, maybe this is not the best place to live. Maybe this coastline, maybe this floodplain is just a little bit too risky, so let's retreat away from here. So I'd say this is characterized as kind of our typical thinking for much of our society. And we think there's a lot of room for thinking about our options more broadly, and maybe thinking about them in a different order. So we'd like to propose a little bit of a new way of thinking about which option should be looked at first, before we sort of jump to defensive structures as our solution to flooding. So you'll notice I've added protect. And when I say protect, I'm thinking about our coastlines and floodplains that don't currently have any people, no roads, no infrastructure, no buildings. If a community has those assets, let's keep them that way, because those are places where no risk is involved, nobody's in harm's way, so let's keep them that way where possible. At the Nature Conservancy, we also believe that retreat from our riskiest floodplains and coastlines also deserves a much more serious consideration. How can we do this thoughtfully and mindfully as we sort of undevelop risky places and return them to nature? And we believe these options should really be evaluated first and foremost before we just jump immediately to a defensive hardened shoreline. And the justification in our minds is really about the costs and benefits. So we find that solutions like protecting our existing undeveloped coastlines and retreating away from them, those are permanent solutions to flooding. The risk for people, the risk for infrastructure is eliminated. They also have the added benefit that nature and natural ecosystems can then adapt to changing climate. So whether it's your wetlands, your dune systems, your floodplains, they now have the room to move and migrate as the climate changes. And they can also then serve as that buffer and that barrier that protects our communities. And we recognize that, there's no one size fits all solution, and that there will be places that sort of adopt more accommodation and defensive approaches, but it should be recognized that these are temporary solutions. They can provide a false sense of security, and there's negative impacts often on our ecosystems. A hardened shoreline is much more likely to reflect that wave energy and cause greater erosion and greater damage to our ecosystems nearby. So we're calling this a flood adaptation hierarchy, and we think this is something that could be implemented whether it's on a sort of individual parcel, an individual homeowner or property owner, all the way up to a sort of municipal planning level. We think there's ways that this sort of framework could be incentivized, sort of codified in regulations or in other planning mechanisms. So I'm going to shift a little bit back to the local governments, who I think so highly of, because in our work with local communities across the state, we see a lot of barriers that's holding communities back from adapting to climate change. Obviously, climate's not the only issue. There's housing and transportation and safety and education. It's a really long list. So it has to sort of compete amongst all of those. But one of the things that we think the Nature Conservancy can influence is a major barrier. It's around funding. So we hear time and time again that navigating funding sources, figuring out the right source, am I eligible? That is standing in the way of so many communities from taking advantage of the dollars out there at the state and federal level and activating good adaptation projects. And we often see this leading to an inequity across the state, where there's some communities who, they figured out how to do this. They've got grant writers on staff and they're able to tap into these funding streams. And then we've got others who, maybe it's a town supervisor and 1 or 2 staff members, and they've got to do a dozen things at once. So they can't think about proactively, how do I pursue that next grant? So it's been a real mission for our team at the Conservancy to really think about how we support local communities tap into funding streams. And it's, things like helping with grant writing. Sometimes we make small grants to be the match or to help catalyze a project. It could take the forms of developing scientific tools, other analyses, decision frameworks, providing different kinds of technical assistance. And then, of course, we've got folks who are up there in Albany and in Washington who can do that advocacy and lobbying on behalf of the communities. So, the better we understand your needs and what the challenges you're facing, the better our folks in Albany and DC can advocate for you. And on that Albany note, I think the theme again and again in this conference has really been about the Bond Act. So gotta mention it here. And it's on this theme of funding. But, I'm proud to be a part of the Conservancy, the Nature Conservancy, because we're really rallying behind the Environmental Bond Act. It's this pretty historic amount of money, which could be used to invest in clean water, clean air, and green jobs. And given the coastal and the flooding focus of this panel, I want to zoom in to about a quarter of that $4.2 billion. What's on the table in November on the ballot would be about $1 billion for restoration and flood risk reduction. And there's lots of great stuff in here. It's about $100 million for coastal and shoreline restoration, about $100 million for inland flooding and waterfront revitalization, $250,000 for voluntary buyouts and restoration, and about $650 million for wetland and stream restoration, raising buildings, moving buildings, and upgrading dams and culverts and bridges. So I think this is really exciting. We hope the outcome's good in November, and then the real interesting work will begin, right? I've sort of positioned the Nature Conservancy as trying to support the local communities. And I think that's what we'll have to figure out together with our local partners is what is our role at how we can tap into these funding streams as they get rolled out at the state level. If all goes well in November. I won't spend too much time on this one because I'm kind of getting close on my time allotment, but there's other big pots of money coming down the line. I think we often think of the Inflation Reduction Act as being something that's about climate mitigation and electrification and upgrading our grid, but there will be some portions of money that can flow to our local communities via federal agencies. And given the theme of this talk, do want to call out that NOAA's got a big chunk of money. So if you're a community that's thinking about how do you prepare for the next extreme storm and changing climate, look to NOAA, because there's about $3 billion over the next 5 years, which will be coming through for a variety of programs. I'm going to start wrapping it up. When I was first writing the talk, I was like, cool, we'll get to talk about all the different communities and the different funding streams that we've worked in and how we help them, get competitive applications in. So I'm just going to put a few up there. These are some of the, they come from federal, state, national different programs where we're basically working in partnership with communities for things that align with our mission and align with the needs of the community to really get them the money so they can do the good adaptation work. And then I'll just wrap up again with this slide with my email address, and that same invitation that I started with is we want to create the solutions, create programs, create tools that really meet the needs of local communities. So it's an open invitation I want to hear from you and learn more about, what are the challenges that you're facing. So I'm going to pass it back to Julie and looking forward to the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Mike. Great presentation. And as a reminder to everyone on the call here, all of these presentations, the recording and the presentations will be made available after the conference on the NYSDEC website. And if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. We will be addressing those later during the Q&A. Now I'd like to introduce Libby Zemaitis. Libby is the Climate Change Program Coordinator at the New York State DEC Hudson River Estuary Program in partnership with the Water Resources Institute at Cornell University. Her work supports local governments in the Hudson Valley to adapt to climate change and build resiliency through community planning, collaborative design, and state policy leadership. Libby leads her team to build partnerships and fund innovation in ecological and equitable solutions. Her previous work includes management consulting and leading startups in the clean tech space. She earned her MBA and MS in climate science and policy from Bard College and BA in geology from Vassar College. Libby, you have the floor.
All right, thank you, Julie. Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be part of this panel, and today I'm going to just talk a little bit about one of our favorite programs to help waterfront communities create a more resilient future along the tidal Hudson River. So I'm representing the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation's Hudson River Estuary Program. We've been around for nearly 40 years to help preserve, protect, and enhance this beautiful region. And the region is the watershed that flows into the tidal Hudson, which is from New York City, 150 miles north to the Troy Dam. So this is a really unique, sensitive region, and we have daily tides and sea level rise along that whole stretch of river. We have many different programs and focus areas, but I lead our group on climate adaptive communities. Thank you, Mike, you gave a great introduction setting the stage, so I won't go too much into kind of the context of what we're facing, but New York State does do modeling to understand what our climate hazards and risks are, so we can be better prepared for those. It's there's a unique situation along the tidal Hudson River where we have almost 90 different municipalities, many of them very small, dealing with flooding and longer term sea level rise. So our coastlines, it basically could be considered a coastal area, and it is considered a coastal area to many people. And these coastlines are changing over time. We already have a lot of flood risk today, and that risk is going to go up over time. You don't need to look at all these numbers, but part of what our team does is to track risk metrics and across all of our communities, so we understand the landscape of what's happening and what's going to be changing. So to illustrate that graphically, I'm going to do a quick case study on the city of Kingston, represented by Julie Noble. We've done a lot of work with Kingston, and I'm going to share some sea level rise and flooding maps. These are actually from a tool from Scenic Hudson that you can also play around with. This shows one portion of the city's waterfront. You'll see here to the east is the Hudson River, and this is what's known as the Kingston Point area. And like many of our waterfront communities, there's a lot going on at the waterfront. So you have businesses, roads, recreational facilities, commercial activities, like here's an oil terminal, here's a public beach, a trolley line. There's, it's a very rich, diverse place, but there's also flooding from multiple angles, from the river, from tributaries like the Rondout Creek here to the south, and then also from more urbanized areas uphill. So this shows today's 1% flood or 100-year flood zone, which is the regulated flood zone. So you can see a large portion of this waterfront is kind of expecting to be flooded every now and then. But then in addition to that, New York State about 5 years ago adopted sea level rise projections. So that's as glaciers melt and thermal expansion of our oceans, coastal areas like the tidal Hudson River will experience sea level rise or river level rise. I've been hearing it referred to more often, just like other coastal areas. And these projections in the mid-Hudson region, which is where Kingston is, are as much as another 71 inches of sea level rise by the end of the century. And we've already had over a foot of sea level rise. And what's more alarming is that the rate of rise is increasing. So you can project those numbers onto this map. And here with 12 inches of sea level rise, so kind of filling up the bathtub, you start to see areas that are light blue. And those are areas that would be inundated with water either all the time or during high tides. And the city is already seeing this. This is actually a parking lot here that's turning into a wetland because the water's encroaching. And then going out further in the century, higher sea level rise, 30 inches, you see a lot more blue, and it covers the road and kind of separates Kingston Point from the rest of the land. 54 inches of sea level rise, more blue and darker blue, which means deeper water, deeper inundation. And then finally, the high scenario for the end of the century, 72 inches of sea level rise. You see that the river has taken back a lot of the land. So this is kind of the starting point with many of our communities is, if you don't do anything, this is, what the future waterfront will look like. So how do we get ahead of this and make good adaptive decisions now? So we're here to really just support that journey, and that journey is going to be different in each community. It's a sensitive issue, and smaller cities have very limited resources to tackle these big issues like sea level rise. So we're here to kind of build that capacity and try to support them. We help provide, a range of adaptation pathways. A lot of what Mike was sharing, we share similar information. We also try to help, people consider other opportunities to address issues alongside climate risks. If you're going to be investing in, a more climate adaptive waterfront, maybe you can also get more amenities, more recreation, more protection. Maybe you can consider other issues like local jobs, housing, et cetera. So really it's about building adaptive capacity. And what that is just not saying, okay, it's going to be wetter, so we're going to have a seawall, or it's going to be drier, so we're going to have this. It's more about just being adaptable and knowing that we're going to have all different types of extremes, and we have to be flexible, and we have to kind of break through those mental barriers. And this is something that we need to be on a personal level, a neighborhood level, a community level, and a regional level. And I know I really got to experience it through COVID and the initial lockdowns, how important being adaptable truly is. So, given kind of some of this bleak information about sea level rise, we've created a vision as a program where all of our communities are thriving, beautiful models for adapting to climate change, and especially using natural and equitable solutions. We achieve that goal through a variety of programs, but today I'm just going to share one of those, and that's the Flood Resiliency Network. This is a way that we bring local governments together to work on issues of flooding and sea level rise as a group instead of individually. So currently there's around 21 local governments participating. The number can fluctuate up and down. And again, the idea is to kind of support this journey, build relationships within and across communities, which also helps with, adaptive capacity, and then bring expertise and authority to the community's doorsteps. So, if they want to talk about DEC grants or DOS programs, we can help bring those people to meet with them. And always we're trying to align and promote existing New York State funding and policy programs, of which there are many. So we've evolved to give a little taste of, how we got to where we are. It's been about almost a decade in the making, and it's grown and evolved over time. It really started, the seed was planted, in our response to the big hurricanes, Irene and Sandy in 2011 and 2012, where we determined as a program, we really wanted to help communities do something about this. So we funded 4 vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans in 4 different waterfront communities in 2012 to 2014. And they were pretty in-depth, year-long processes where they went through identifying their vulnerabilities, looking at adaptation solutions, doing cost-benefit analysis, community outreach. But our insight was that if you look across all of these, the 4 adaptation plans, there's so much similarity. So why does every municipality have to do this work on their own? They shouldn't have to. And that was the idea of getting that group together. So first it was a learning group of 4 communities, and it's grown to about 21 today. It's had the benefit of many different partners. Some have become more or less involved over time. Right now, New York Sea Grant, Hudson River Watershed Alliance, and the Consensus Building Institute are very highly involved, but it's very collaborative overall. And so far, the network has been funded by our annual local stewardship planning grants, which are smaller planning grants. We have been making some progress in trying to get more steady annual funding through a partnership with Cornell as well, but it's still small, very small scale funding. What do we offer? How do we function? Local governments, we try to put at the center of the Flood Resilience Network. So we address issues that they bring to us, and that can be a wide range of topics. I just added here, a handful that we've addressed over the years, talking about, wastewater treatment infrastructure. How do we adapt it to sea level rise? How do we site and locate green infrastructure, emergency management plans, flood insurance, community engagement, and then all the funding opportunities that have come up over time. So we address these in different ways. We have larger in-person workshops and site visits that are hosted by the communities, where we actually get to go be on the waterfront and hear what the community is doing, what challenges they've had, what successes they've had. And then we have more frequent webinars, lunch and learns, where partners bring new tools and resources to the group. So just to wrap up here, a couple more slides. The group has really become, the group is, they're a bunch of leaders, and they're leaders together and independently. These communities have won probably actually now way more than $7 million in waterfront resilience grants, because I don't think that includes the entire list of communities anymore. But the point is they've leveraged a lot of money. They've done upgrades to infrastructure, waterfront parks, shorelines. They've incorporated resilience into their local plans, developed climate adaptive designs. And then recently they inspired a new coastal resilience network, a similar type of idea in Long Island. So moving forward, we hope to continue to grow the membership, make it accessible, working on a strategic roadmap now to do that, and then just continue to address the needs that the communities bring to us. My last slide is, related to the theme of today's conference, which is funding. More and more funding is becoming available. Climate change is a very important issue that's only growing. So what we try to do is help communities tee up projects and create kind of a pipeline, so that when funding does become available, they can take advantage of it. And there's so much planning and design that needs to go in to really create great projects. Otherwise, you could have maybe not so great projects or not really be ready to accept that money. So one thing we do is we create a roundup every year of existing funding. There's a lot of it out there, and we'll continue to do that. So please keep in touch with us if you're interested in seeing that. And we have a newsletter that we send out every other month if you want to sign up for that. And yeah, like Mike said, please keep in touch and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, Julie.
Great. Thank you so much, Libby. I'd now like to introduce Jim Tierney. Jim is the Deputy Commissioner for Water Resources within the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Jim has management responsibility for all clean water programs, including sewage and industrial wastewater treatment plants, programs to address polluted runoff from concentrated animal feed operations, construction excavations and urbanized areas, water quality standards, stream classifications, and water quality assessments. This includes the management of multiple grant programs, often exceeding $100 million, and coordination oversight of the $1 billion Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund with the Environmental Facilities Corporation. Jim, the floor is all yours. I'm going to make sure you are unmuted. You are currently muted. Hold on one second. Yeah. That's something I need to do on my end, isn't it? Are you able to unmute? Okay.
I am now unmuted, Julie. Thank you.
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Well, hey, first of all, Mike and Libby, terrific presentations, and I enjoyed them, and I learned from them. And Julie, thanks for all you do. I really appreciate the work and of you and the Association of Conservation Commissions here in New York. It's a big deal. I want to just maybe take because Mike and Libby got into some of the some of the rationale. I'm going to try and run through a few things, but then talk very much in the realms of brass tacks, because I know that the conservation commissions are the people that make a lot of work happen right at the local level, and I really respect that. Now, just generally from climate resilience, people in this field think in terms of 5 major buckets. Is it coastal storms, extreme heat, wildfire? We haven't had that much of it in New York, but we had some pretty big wildfires in the Hudson Valley this summer. Drought, of course, and then flood. And as was mentioned, the proposed bond act, depending on how you read it, has at least $1.1 billion generally categorized under flood risk reductions. But you'll realize that a lot of the actions you can take have co-benefits. Think of green infrastructure in the urban environment. It has a pollution reduction component, a localized flood abatement component. It has an urban cooling component and an urban beautification component. and even a habitat component. So so there's all these different elements that when we look at how we would potentially use the Bond Act funds, one of the things that most people in our field of work think in terms of is how do you not solve one problem but maybe solve 4 or 5 at the same time by tuning the practices to have multiple co-benefits. You frequently hear that term. The other term you hear, just as a rule of thumb, is that we're going to get resilient not by any silver bullet. There's no one solution. It's really silver buckshot or silver BBs scattered over the landscape that make a system more resilient. And there's many different ways you can look at it, including communities where people know each other better tend to be more resilient communities, because after an event, people go and knock on each other's doors and check up on each other. That's actually been shown in a number of studies. Just do people know each other, and are they friends? And that makes a community more resilient. But the area that I wanted to talk about is just this whole drought and deluge problem. We have to think in terms of particular programs, because we deliver programs. And what I want to do is maybe talk about the type of programs we do at DEC in collaboration with other state agencies and the federal government, and how funds can amp these programs up. Mike, you had a slide of Lake Ontario during either 2017 or 2019. In 2017, there was a flood of record on Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River, well beyond anything they had experienced since records were kept. And lo and behold, they went higher in 2019. In response to that, we had a $300 million program in New York. It results in my area about 132 separate projects, all done by municipalities, all done in cooperation with municipalities, for localized flood risk abatement and infrastructure, flood resiliency. And that was in the Lake Ontario, St. Lawrence River area. The people in Lake Erie are asking for the same thing, and the people along Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River say, we're not done yet. We have a lot more to do than just the projects that are currently underway. We have another program that we developed post-Sandy that I think is very applicable to inland flooding throughout New York State. It's called the Resilient New York Streams Program. It goes on like this, and this is something I know local officials will appreciate. There's studies that are paid for by DEC, 100% paid for. We have about 71 different watersheds in practice. It's very quantitative. It's not sort of soft, fuzzy stuff. We do real hydraulic modeling, real stream assessments, and about over the course of about 6 to 8 months, it costs us about $80,000. And what it does is it doesn't come up with the specific project proposals, but it comes up with specifically what you should do in particular locations. Should you reconnect to a wetland here, restore a floodplain there, remove a culvert pinch point there, elevate a bridge that acts like a dam and causes floodwaters to go down Main Street during a high-level storm. And so what you get through the Resilient New York Stream Studies program, if you're a municipal official or a conservation committee member, is the top 20 things you could do in your watershed with a heavy focus on naturalized mechanisms, habitat restoration and the like, that can help you reduce flooding. And so an example of that is the Sequoia Creek up near Utica. It was one of our earlier ones. A local hero, Sean Coletta, the supervisor of the town of Whitesboro, took it on. It's earned $9 million in grants to implement the projects. And it goes from this overall quantitative study, which shows what needs to be done, the projects listed in priority order for their benefit, gives you a big list of things to do for flood abatement, and then you tick them off starting with a design, a 10% design, sort of an engineering report, which is the keys to the kingdom for big funding. And we think that once all these projects that are currently slated are done on Sequoia Creek, a creek which has flooded over 30 times of record, we think it won't flood during the 100-year storm, plus a full 30% increment to count for climate change, expected climate change precipitation. So it gives you some sense that program for inland flooding and for ice jams would give our local communities a blueprint to make things happen in a very systematic way. Think of, you have the mosaic pattern, and then you fill in the pieces with individual projects. And as Mike went through, we have all the coastal issues in New York. Right now, my program oversees, in the order of $3.7 billion in Army Corps projects that are underway, that are finished or underway post-Sandy. But to give you some sense of the type of dollars we're thinking about when it comes to coastal work, the recently released study by the Army Corps for the greater New York, New Jersey harbor and estuary area, the cost estimate right now is in the order of $52 billion. One project alternative that they looked at, this giant barrier wall, is in the order of $150 billion. So it really does mean that a lot of the resiliency issues are planning, but also money issues. We're going to have to figure out some way to fund it. But then there's just basic common sense, like, do we map things properly? Are our FEMA floodplain maps up to date and digitized, and not just having, the past storms, but account for climate change, and not just the 100-year storm, but perhaps the 500-year storm? Are our building codes up to snuff, and are we looking in particular areas that are vulnerable, locally increasing the stringency of building codes to account for what's expected in climate change? Some communities have done that on Long Island very successfully. There's protecting wetlands and streams. There was that saying a while ago that one of the key things we have to do for water quality and habitat and for flood resiliency is slow stormwater down, spread it out, and soak it in. And when you soak it in, you also recharge groundwater for drought. So that whole program that we have, either to buy or protect or regulate streams and wetlands, that's where water is stored. And there's a lot of scientific studies showing that in areas where wetlands exist in a relatively high level, the overall level of flooding is reduced. And New York State, according to the National Academy of Sciences, has lost somewhere north of 60% of the wetlands that were in New York State at colonial times. Green infrastructure, I'm sure you're very familiar with that. We have over 100 flood control projects in New York. I am blessed with having maintained about 80 miles of levees to make sure, in some communities they really rely on it. And then something very interesting that people should keep in mind here. There's other focused programs, like New York State DOT has something called the Bridge New York program. So if you in your community have a bridge or a culvert that acts as a pinch point during a storm, water backs up and starts heading down Main Street, the Bridge New York program might be for you, and getting in touch with your local town supervisor, public works supervisor who has relationships with Department of Transportation. You might be able to span that bridge or that waterway in a higher level. And of course, while you do it, you want to put in a natural bottom as opposed to some sort of culvert break that reduce, so that you increase stream and habitat connectivity. We're doing the same on wastewater treatment plants. When people are doing their asset management programs now, it's also an asset management program for energy efficiency and resiliency. So, and the last thing I wanted to mention before I just give you a kind of like an example is the federal funding. And I think, Libby mentioned this, Mike mentioned this. This, I don't know if you can see the thickness of it, but it's about almost a half-inch thick. That's just the summary by the Georgetown Climate Center of the different funding programs for just resiliency that are part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. They're serious. And then, as Mike mentioned, in the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a whole array of additional programs. The way you access those funds is to get a project ready to go. The key to the grant kingdom is getting a project that's been identified, getting, if it's an engineered project, get to the 10% level of design. Usually it would cost about between $30,000 and $50,000, and we have We have some existing grant programs in the wastewater field, for example, to do that. And once you have that engineering report, and proposal on what it does, usually has basic environmental alternatives assessment, a cost estimate. That $25,000 to $50,000 investment can open up the keys to $10 million in grant funding. And you can take it to go to the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or go to DEC, or go to the Environmental Facilities Corporation, and get your funds. So that's the real trick. If you do resiliency planning and get a project proposal designed, that's what you have for 90% of the effectiveness for an application for funding. Just something to keep in mind. And I want to give you something that I find very hopeful. A number of years ago in Sandy, a wastewater treatment plant known as the Bay Park Wastewater Treatment Plant, because people remember stories, right, Julie, was inundated in some parts by as much as 9 feet of salt water. And this is a regional wastewater treatment plant. It serves over 550,000 people. It was largely destroyed. The plant now has been completely rebuilt. And it's been rebuilt so that we have nitrogen treatment systems on it, because nitrogen's the problem down in Long Island. That nitrogen pollution was the problem for impairment in Long Island. Reduced about nitrogen pollution levels by 70%. We also rebuilt the entire system with a 500-year level of flood resiliency. Now, you may think that 500 years is the biblical storm. It's not. People who are in the 500-year floodplain have a better chance of being inundated during a storm than somebody has catching fire to their house. And who doesn't have fire insurance, right, on their home? We connected 2 plants to that Bay Park plant, so we consolidated 2 lousy plants into a superior regional plant. We were going to connect the city of Long Beach's wastewater treatment plant, which is sort of ridiculously located on a barrier island. We're going to connect that in so that waste has superior treatment. And we're going to take the entire, and the project is actually underway, waste stream from the Bay Park plant, connect it to an existing ocean outfall, and put the treated effluent 3 miles out into the ocean, where there's vast assimilative capacity for that effluent. We're taking it out of the western bays marsh areas of southern Nassau County. And those marsh islands that dot southern Nassau County serve as a very robust habitat. They serve, but they also serve as the front line in resiliency during storms. There's been a series of very good peer-reviewed papers that show that if you protect the marshlands along the coast, you basically are creating a natural flood wall against storm inundation. And so we're doing that. And by the way, the western bays within Nassau County is severely impaired due to nitrogen. And experts at SUNY Stony Brook tell me that once we remove this effluent from these shallow, warm western bays, in about 2 years, we'll see a vast recovery in the overall ecosystem. So it gives you some sense of how you could take a problem, a serious problem like the western bays and the Bay Park wastewater treatment plant, and through systematic investments, build systematic resiliency that also has a habitat and a water quality benefit. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Jim. We're going to turn to some questions and answers. Folks have been filling things into the chat, lots of great comments, and I pulled out a couple of the questions. So any of the panelists, if you feel like you want to chime in on this, please, I encourage you to do so. So I'll go in reverse order. Does the potential of the Thwaites Glacier collapse play into your adaptive thinking and recommendations? Is there any modeling around the rate of sea level rise as a result of this doomsday scenario?
You know, we regularly update. We have an official sea level rise projection in New York. It's regularly updated, but I can tell that given what we're seeing about the melting in the Arctic and Antarctic or Greenland ice cap, that it's likely that New York State will periodically update those to try and take into account just what the questioner mentioned. But we're not. I don't believe we're there yet.
And we often try to encourage, so all the projections are a range from most likely to least likely, and we encourage communities to be more risk adverse and plan for the higher scenarios, because then you'll be, all set if something does happen, but it's up to the community to kind of decide what their risk tolerance is.
Great, thank you. The US Supreme Court is currently reviewing wetlands related to protection under the Clean Water Act. What are the legal strengths that New York State and municipalities can put in place to protect wetlands, given this data, which affects inland wetlands as well? Will a change in federal law affect what New York State is doing?
Well, it's the dual sovereignty issue, right, Julie, where while the federal EPA and Army Corps have their own regulatory programs, there's nothing stopping New York or local communities from going further. And there's numerous areas under New York law where we've gone well beyond the federal minimum. That includes wetlands, and increasingly likely under the quite possible Supreme Court decision, which would ratchet back what's within the Clean Water Act's jurisdiction dramatically if it goes in the worst scenario. It allows local governments, still have the ability to protect their own wetlands and streams and regulate them. Same thing in New York State, and we plan to keep doing that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to what Jim said. New York State's going in the right direction, right? In the last budget, the Freshwater Wetlands Act basically raised the bar or lowered it, but now wetlands down to 7 and something acres also need to be permitted when actions happen. So I mean that's a positive sign, despite what might happen in the wrong direction at the federal level.
Thank you. There was a question from Richard. I may need some clarification on this, but it was, could TNC use a similar intervention model on freshwater flooding? I'm not sure what the context of that was. Maybe Mike?
Julie, I'm guessing it has to do with the sort of the proposal to flip the defend as first option, and and I'm guessing that's the framework that's being asked. And I mean, I would say that sort of was that flood adaptation hierarchy was created with all of our floodplains and coastlines that New York had in mind. So yeah, I think the idea that we could really probe what are the options for protecting our undeveloped floodplains, what are our options for retreat before we jump to hardening. Yeah, that could be applicable to our coastal environments, our Great Lakes, and our riverine systems as well.
And along that same line, given that hardening is the least helpful adaptation, what recommendations are there for New York City? That's a very loaded question.
Yeah, I don't know if we have a full hour. I mean, it's certainly one of the places with some of the highest value of real estate value. So that's going to be a place where there's going to be more hardening, and that's the reality, and I think that's okay. But New York City has 520 miles of coastline, and they all look really different. And there will be places where retreat or leaving them as natural wetlands and floodplains are also available. So I mean, I think that's what we want to offer in this idea of this framework, is that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There's a lot of context. There's a lot of pros, cons to weigh, and a place like New York City, is going to be a little bit different than a more rural environment.
And just to add on to what Mike said, in New York City, in Ida, we were stunned at the level of inland flooding. I used to live in Kew Gardens, Queens. When I saw Queens Avenue and Queens Boulevard looking like a river, it was just stunning. Now, southern Queens, they get flooding fairly frequently, but you just hadn't seen that in northern Queens yet. And the level of flooding in southern Westchester during Ida was just stunning. I mean, some portions of the village of Mamaroneck had 14 feet of water on it. So what we do have right now is concepts such as how do you hold water on the urban landscape? That falls into the realm, this vast landscape architecture area of expertise known as green infrastructure. And that's something I think most people are familiar with. But one thing people, particularly focused in New York City, might want to do right now is we're in a public comment period on the New York, New Jersey harbor and tributaries study. It's a very extensive study covering both, basically the greater New York harbor region. As I mentioned, the initial cost estimate for the one that's been called the tentatively selected plan, though it's very tentatively selected and it's in public comment period, is about $52 billion. And these are projects that would take literally decades to ultimately get in place, depending on which one is adopted. But you could go onto the U.S. Army Corps New York District website, or just Google New York, New Jersey HATS, H-A-T-S, and get that study. And we really do encourage people to comment on it and think whether or not what's been proposed as an option under this Army Corps study is something that comports with your, with what you would like to see. And if there are alternatives that you think would be better, we're all ears. Thanks.
Thank you. Can you recommend good resources with evidence of the importance of protecting trees and mitigating flooding?
I don't have those on the tip of my tongue, but I can certainly have some colleagues who do. So I think that's from Karen. I'm happy to connect with you and point you in those directions, unless Libby or Jim has anything better to say.
We're all for trees, and in New York City, for example, as part of their CSO combined sewer overflow abatement program, they have under a program that we under a DEC consent order, New York City Department of Environmental Protection has implemented over 11,000 individual practices. Many of them are something referred to as tree pits, where you plant a tree, but then you also have a base to that tree that absorbs a lot of water. Stormwater gets directed into it. It holds it, infiltrates it into the ground, and ultimately results in less, raw sewage being blown out during a storm event. So, you can, and then if you go upstate, I know Libby has done this with the Hudson River Estuary program. We call it the Trees for Tribs program. We want to plant trees along all these tributaries, for erosion reduction, for habitat, and for cooling. It's something that we like to see going along trout streams, because trout need cool and colder water. We shade the streams, which makes them healthier. So across the board, trees are a net plus, right?
Okay, we have time for one more question. Do you know when FEMA might update its flood maps? Are you concerned that communities are operating with inaccurate information and guidance on where it's safe to build?
I am. FEMA, in some parts of the state, if you go to the FEMA flood insurance rate maps, you have updated digitized modern maps. In some counties in New York State, they're blueprints from 1980. And so it's been an issue that I've raised with FEMA about getting the funding and the resources and the process going to get flood maps put in place. But also, there's issues with a set of mapping known as the coastal erosion hazard areas. And those in many areas are badly out of date. And it's an issue that needs to be tackled, because that gives very good information for Long Island's coast, New York City's coast, the Great Lakes coasts. And we would like to see those updated and modernized as well.
And another thought on that is that, even if they're updated, they don't consider future scenarios yet. And New York State did release a flood risk management guidance that recommends, building to sea level rise in addition and increasing freeboard. And there's a lot of detail on, how to design better, and municipalities could, adopt this and enforce these rules.
Great. Well, this is all the time that we have as we transition to our next panel. So I want to thank Mike and Libby and Jim and everyone who came here today to be part of this. I hope that you got something out of it. I sure did myself. Thank you for being so engaging. All of these presentations will be available after the conference, and I encourage you to go back to GatherTown and continue on with your day, share time with people, go to more panels, and have a great day, everyone. It's a beautiful day outside, so if you don't want to stick around, spend time outside. It is beautiful out. All right, thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.